In West Africa, the Tuareg are a common theme. They come up every single time you bring up any civilization. This starts from way before today. For example, one of the biggest groups that are mentioned against the oldest kingdom, the Kingdom of Ghana, is the Tuareg. The Tuareg are brought up as a group of people who are, maybe it will be fair to call them pre-Tuareg, who are a constant threat to the Kingdom of Ghana, and they fight back and forth. Mali has Tuaregs, and so forth and so on. One common theme, though, with the Tuareg is origin. Where do they come from? It's very typical for people to think that it comes from Mali because, of course, they look like the same people in Mali, and of course, they look the same as other Africans that we will find in the Sahel. This is a fair assessment if you think about it, because why else would they be there? Now, judging on their dances, judging on everything else, they are purely African in all ways. But where exactly do they come from? These people, the Tuareg, are firmly put somewhere in Morocco as their origin. Now, remember, Morocco is that area that had that oldest civilization in the top. And of course, it combines the cultures of Africa in the Sahel regions and Africa in the north with all the Tumalus and everything. Now, the Tuareg are probably the missing piece between these two places because they are mentioned over and over again by several different Muslim scholars as being the group that travels the most in between the areas of Morocco and the Sahel regions, Mauritania and such. Now, these people, of course, have something more than just their location to prove this. The thing that matters most is their language, a language preserved from Berber. Now, it's very interesting that this language was preserved because, of course, if we look at Morocco, where they allegedly came from, the Berber languages are a minority. The dominant languages are Standard Arabic and Moroccan style Arabic as the second spoken language. And then you get all the way down. I think French is third, and then the last one is Berber. As far as we know, the Berber languages have existed in North Africa for thousands of years. Even before the writing system of ancient Egypt, we know that there must have been this language in this area. Now, of course, if we look at the populations in North Africa, the Berber being a minority is a recent thing. And because of this, we can look back into its history and see the Ibermerusians, the Ibero-Mauritians who existed in this area for thousands of years. Interestingly, the oldest DNA ever uncovered in Africa is from Morocco, from 15,000 years ago, and it shows broad sub-Saharan African DNA. Now, exactly what does broad sub-Saharan African DNA, and of course, it also shows Natufian DNA, which we'll talk about another time. It's not interesting for this conversation, but the sub-Saharan DNA that it shows, which is interesting because how can you be sub-Saharan African if you've never been in sub-Sahara, which that DNA does not show up in sub-Sahara in the same way. Now it is related to all the other sub-Saharans, but you cannot place it in a specific group. In other words, it's neither Dinka nor Malian, nor Igbo, nor none of those groups. It's a more broad DNA. And of course, it makes sense. I mean, it's for 15,000 years ago. What else would you expect it to be? In sharp contrast, the ancient Egyptians only go back to about 1500 BC in terms of DNA. Nothing has been extracted earlier than this date, at least not for now. And of course, the further back you go, the more you expect even deeper sub Saharan African DNA. And you also expect it to show more broadness in its DNA rather than what you will see, which is what a lot of people are hoping for, to find a specific group and say that's the group of the ancient Egyptians, that's the type of Black African that existed there. But instead, we're probably going to see what we see in North Africa, which is a wide variety. It's no surprise then that we see this type of image. Now, remember that all in North Africa, from Herodotus and all of this, they talk about people who existed in these areas who are veiled. The people, the Tuareg, are always veiled. And we see this all over the place. And in fact, they mention that in other societies, especially if you start looking at the Islamic era, women are veiled. But if you go and look at North Africa, it's the men that are veiled more than the females, and this is consistent with the culture that existed at the time. Now, like I said, the language of the Tuareg and closer groups, other groups that represent these Berbers that still exist throughout from north all the way down to south, would not be a shock if they spoke Arabic and some other kind of African language. So, for example, if they spoke Niger Congo language, or they spoke a Sudanic language, or they even spoke a Bantu language, it would not be a shock to us at all. The fact that they speak a Berber language is weird because, of course, the Berber languages are mainly represented in North Africa with very, let's say, loose connections in the south of North Africa, except in the modern times where you get entire regions that are more common down to the south, which means there's always been a connection in those two areas. And of course, the language that should be dominant is Arabic within those people. If they came from North Africa in modern times, the language that they should speak is North African, but they speak Berber. Berber, again, like I mentioned, a minority language in North Africa. But not only that, there's no need to teach it to foreigners. For example, if the Tuareg were foreigners, then there would be no need to teach it to them when the language of communication, I mean, in Morocco, has been various different languages. They could have taught them any of the European languages that dominated at one time, Greek, blah 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 blah. And instead they speak this Berber language, they're part of this giant group, they have exactly the same cultures as any of the other groups, and they've been part of these groupings that exist in those areas, the Sanhajas and all these other types of people. They've joined paths and guilds. Something that has reduced interest within the Berber populations, even if you talk about the Kanem regions, is a lack of interest in African masks. Now, I'm not saying that they don't have any. Of course, I've showed you that even in North Africa, some of these people have mask traditions that are similar to those that you find in the Sahel. But you will notice that even these people have a much less interest in things like African masks. But let's check this video out for context now that I've given you a foundationary layout of these people. And oh yeah, the Tuareg are traditionally and historically related to the Garamantes.
Why is the topic of ethnic and racial identification in the modern countries of the Maghreb and Egypt such a hotly debated topic?
Simply put, it has a lot at stake because a lot of groups make claims about what it means if the North Africans would be one group or another. Some groups start to claim that Africa has no real understanding or no real civilizations, as what they call the cradle of civilizations really start in Egypt, somewhere in the Middle East, the Sumerians, and China, and even possibly the Americas, not possibly, actively in the Americas, because the areas in proper Africa are not considered the cradle of civilization. This would mean everything for a lot of people. Now, of course, when we look at North Africa, the Maghreb regions, we see that their history is about the same as the rest of Africa in terms of development, except, in West Africa, they developed iron. But yes, there is a sort of looking away because it's important to understand what groups mean to certain people.
Today, we're going to be taking a look at the historic and modern day genetics of the population of North Africa, which regions influence them, and how the people currently identify. When
So I want to stress that a lot of the times when people talk about genetics, they're not geneticists themselves. And I don't mean if you have to be a geneticist to talk about genetics, but it's very weird for a lot of people to start going into genetics deeply, even if they have no understanding. I've done it before, and it seems like people just disagree about what the results are showing. So I just leave that alone because in real life, it's only going to be conclusive when we have way more studies about any of these regions because of course you could strike gold and then like other places in Africa where they kept getting results that were not right. So for example, in the Americas, they claimed that the Bantu DNA was not represented within the African American population because most of the people were coming from West Africa. But then as the DNA kept coming in, not only did they find Bantu DNA inside of West African in of Americans. They also found East African DNA, which is interesting.
referring to the region of North Africa, the countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt are always included, while places like Sudan, Western Sahara, and Mauritania are usually included, and on occasion the northern portions of a few sub-Saharan African countries like Mali, Niger, and Chad are also included from a geographic and cultural perspective.
Now, of course, even though these places are included, so for example, the Maghreb and Egypt are included in North Africa most of the time. But we must remember there's a reason why the Maghreb is called the Maghreb. It is to some degree removed from North Africa historically and realistically. I mean, if you look at Egypt and you compare it to the rest of North Africa, there is no comparison.
The genetic history of North Africa has certainly fluctuated greatly ever since humans first inhabited the region around 45,000 years ago, with
I don't know why he's saying 45,000 years ago when we know that one of the oldest skulls found on Earth are in Morocco, and Morocco obviously is in North Africa, and are related to migrating patterns with North African and East Africans. We have seen geneticists and historians and archaeologists and blah, 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 people who study prehistoric Africa, connecting these two regions together and showing that Africans have been traveling throughout Africa forever. And so North Africa in Jebel Irhoud have had history going back millions of years. So I don't know why he's saying that thing about 45,000 years ago. It's a pretty strange date.
For a long time, it was believed that the oldest Homo sapiens fossils were from East Africa, that we as a species, Homo sapiens, evolved in East Africa. But what if I actually told you that the oldest fossilized Homo sapiens remains were found in North Africa?
So I don't know where he gets the date of 45,000 years ago. It's a pretty strange. I don't know what that relates to.
the first humans most likely crossing over from the Arabian Peninsula through modern day Suez in Egypt.
Okay, so now it's starting to make sense. So basically, what he's saying is North Africa was empty, and then a bunch of people 45,000 years ago, by the way, there's no proof of this whatsoever. Some people from 45,000 years ago came into Africa from the Middle East inside. There is no proof of this whatsoever. The oldest chance that people came from outside of Africa, which these people would have essentially been Africans themselves, is maybe from about, you know, 5, 10, 15,000 years ago, who came into that area. But they would have been essentially the same as the African population. And of course, Africans kept leaving Africa and going to the Middle East. We have evidence of this, but that's a story for another day.
Therefore, the native people of North Africa were most closely related to the Middle Eastern populations of Arabia and the Levant, but created their own gene pool after thousands of years of separation and adaptation to their new environment.
Okay, so this is an extreme version of the North Africans or Middle Eastern idea. This idea, of course, is very, very controversial and nobody believes that they came from 45,000 years ago. There's no proof of this, and you can't prove it even one bit. You can't even say that about most groups in Africa that, oh yeah, they were here in this specific location 45,000 years ago. We don't know that for a fact. And so to claim that we know it about North Africans is weird.
During the subsequent waves of migration between the Middle East and North Africa, a common linguistic and ethnic identity between the Arabs and the North African natives, largely known as Berbers, was established, with modern Berber languages being Afro-Asiatic, loosely related to Arabic, Hebrew, and the Habesha languages of the Horn of Africa.
Again, we have multiple problems here. Most linguists think that the language of Afro-Asiatic started in Africa, not in the Middle East. And also the spread of the language all the way down to the South doesn't make sense, given the fact that a lot of the people in the South don't have the DNA of any of the Berbers. For example, if we take East Africans, they don't have Berber DNA, but they speak an Afro-Asiatic language. So clearly, if the language came, it did not come with the Berbers. If it came into Africa from the outside, it did not come in with the Berbers, because there are several groups in Africa who don't speak this language due to the Berbers.
The Sahara Desert has, in the past and modern day, served as an effective barrier between the peoples and fauna of North Africa and the much larger region of sub-Saharan Africa. Although
The Sahara is difficult to cross, but it has never served as a barrier. And the only time you hear this word barrier being used is when people want to talk about the sub-Saharan influence on top of it. But like I said, 15,000 years ago, we find DNA of sub-Saharan African DNA inside of North Africa. This is confirmed DNA. So there is no point of calling it a separated area. We know it's not separated.
that doesn't mean that there was no contact, as West African DNA is very common in modern North Africans, not only through the slave trade, but through merchants and travelers from places like the Mali or Songhai empires of West Africa.
Hitting all the themes. Well, here's the thing. A lot of the DNA of slavery inside of Morocco is not as simple as sub-Saharan African, because of course people of Morocco, we know, enslaved white Europeans, they enslaved their own people, they enslaved Arabs, and they also enslaved other people. So the only one that seems to make an increase at this time, by estimations, is sub-Saharan African DNA, which wasn't even the bulk of slavery at the time. Also, modern North Africans have actually got less DNA of sub-Saharan Africans than you would think. Most of them range from about 3% to about 10 to 20%, which is very small.
As most people know, the entirety of the Mediterranean region of North Africa was annexed by the Roman Empire from early on, but one thing
Well, I don't know what early on means, but the Roman Empire did have a giant part of North Africa. Would I say most of North Africa? No, these are very strategic locations on the coast of North Africa. North African countries are pretty large. I would say Egypt and some other areas are very dominated. I don't know how accurate this map is in terms of colonization, but even looking at this map, we're not looking at a pure dominated North Africa.
people might not have expected is that there's actually a tentative connection between modern Maghrebis and Germanic peoples through the ancient group known as the Vandals, who traveled from modern Germany to establish colonies and kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula and North Africa.
I'm glad he recognizes that this DNA is less about something more ancient, because I've heard some people say that something like 30% of North Africans were like blonde in prehistoric times, which would be ridiculous.
Now, seeing how the population of the provinces of the Maghreb in the Roman Empire were around 2 to 3 million at the time of collapse, and the Vandals invaded and established a kingdom with around 100,000 settlers and soldiers, This would mean that up to 5% of the gene pool of modern Maghrebis could be of Germanic origin, seeing how the Vandals were essentially completely assimilated into the future societies.
Well, if we're talking about Morocco, then we also know that there was an expulsion of people from Al Andalus moving back into North Africa because of the regain or the taking over of native European lands by the natives of Europe. And they pushed out a large group of people. And a lot of those people they pushed out were actually 100% European. They just happened to live the same culture as the rest of the people of Al Andalus or the Moors. And these people who were pushed out influenced deeply the history and the genetics of Morocco, which is why today you can find people with up to 20% of European DNA, sometimes way larger than that, in North Africa. And a lot of them are shocked by that DNA, but you wouldn't be if you knew the history. Now, of course, with this increase of European DNA inside North Africans, you would expect what? You would expect that the people's skin colors would change dramatically given the fact that they have an addition. So you're looking at here a map and it shows 39% North African, 31% Sephardic Jews or North African, 21% Iberian, 21%. That is 21% European, 4% Nigerian. Yeah, I am African for sure. I love that. And then you have a 3.2%. I think that's Mediterranean. I can't see because it's blocked. But yes, this is the typical breakdown of North African DNA. And a lot of people actually have no idea about this. We're talking about this level of influence from multiple regions into this one land. And of course, the only one they go, oh yeah, the only one that came in through slavery was the Nigerian one, must be through slavery. It's like, how do you know? What are you talking about? Nigerians have been going to Morocco for thousands of years, and then there's the ones that came in the last 100 years. So when do you put it?
Not only had Germanic peoples settled in and assimilated into the Maghreb, but also Italic peoples from the Italian peninsula during Roman occupation. These Latin speaking peoples established their own language and culture in the Maghreb and actually had the beginnings of a Latin based language similar to Spanish or Italian, and the European influence can greatly be seen in the region, especially places like Tunisia, where up to 5 or 10% of the gene pool is of early Latin origin.
Or late Latin DNA? Because, of course, they were around later, and we cannot break it down and say that they were early or late because, of course, yeah, DNA came. Now, I don't want anybody to mistake this. They must have left some DNA. The Roman Empire must have left some DNA in the region, but that would speak to a transitionary period rather than native.
Ancient Greece and Egypt have been strongly connected culturally for thousands of years, and although the modern day countries of Greece and Egypt might not have much in common in any major capacity, it's easy to see the relationship between the two from a historic perspective by looking at architecture and place names like Alexandria or Thebes.
Outside of Greece stealing most of their ideas from ancient Egypt and then applying them back into Egypt through the Romans later on when because a lot of people they don't see the Roman style buildings a lot of the time because they're not that interesting to a lot of people, but they don't see the Roman style buildings inside of North Africa from I mean the Romans were there for hundreds of years. So we're talking about a large population that occupied the space for a very long time. So yes, the architecture will be similar, but it's not early, and the similarities are merely borrowing. You do not see this similarity that you're talking about that goes back thousands of years. Greece would be nothing in the beginning stages of Egypt. Egypt, especially if you're talking about some of the brilliant buildings that you see prior to the slow collapse of Egypt.
The Greek presence was especially apparent during antiquity with the rise of Alexander's empire and the Roman Empire, with some places having up to 30% Greek origin and a largely Hellenized culture, but gradually waned over the centuries, with the last major Greek presence in the region being in the early 1900s.
I actually agree with this point. Yes, a lot of people in Egypt are mixed with European DNA, and I'm actually surprised how many people in Egypt ignore this part of their DNA and pretend like their entire DNA is native except their African side, the Black African side. Every single other part they go, no, that's native to the regions, even though we know for a fact that they were dominated for hundreds of years by outsiders.
Today, around 5% of the Egyptian gene pool is of Greek or ancient Macedonian origin. The appearance
Well, that really depends on how you break it down. But yes, I do agree that they have a high amount of European DNA.
of ancient Egyptians has been heavily debated by different groups with various agendas.
Well, I would say every group that I've run into that debates about Egypt has agendas. I haven't seen one group where I go, these guys have absolutely no agenda.
But in the past few thousand years, Egypt had been inhabited by Afro-Asiatic peoples related to Arabs, Berbers, and other Semites.
It's trying to say that fast so nobody can pause in this region. No, Africa was not inhabited mainly by Semites in this region. And the group you're talking about, Afro-Asiatic, is not just related to those languages you mentioned. Now, I know why you mentioned only those two and didn't mention any of the others that you have already shown.
Speaking their own language that would be considered mutually unintelligible with modern Egyptian Arabic.
Well, isn't that strange? Usually, when a language comes from one direction, usually they actually are mutually intelligible. That's why Akkadian and Arabic are sort of communicable languages. But when you start going to ancient Egypt and Berber, there is a lot of loss.
And contrary to popular belief, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs were not exactly an alphabet in the same way that the Latin, Arabic, or Cyrillic scripts were used, but it did evolve into and influence some of the world's earliest writing systems used in the Middle East, such as Phoenician.
What does that have to do with anything?
Ancient Egyptian is currently a dead language, although Egypt's sizable Christian minority, making up 10 to 15% of the population, known as the Copts, use a language known as Coptic in religious ceremonies for liturgical reasons, and Coptic is largely believed to be descended from the pre-Arabic Egyptian language. The
Well, the history of the Coptic language is actually deeper than that. It actually helped us decipher the languages of ancient Egypt. And I say languages because, of course, we speak of it as if there was only one dialect in ancient Egypt, but there actually were multiple. And of course, the ancient Egyptian language transformed over and over again, depending on which era we're talking about. Now, when we're talking about the modern era, the Coptic era is what defines the ancient Egyptian religion. And because it helped us decipher the language, it means that 100% it is related to ancient Egyptian, which throws away claims that it is not Afro-Asiatic because Coptic is, and it throws away claims that the ancient Egyptian language is dead because clearly it's alive in Coptic. It's just different. It's the same as saying any language is dead just because it has a new revised version of it. Now, of course, Coptic is not ancient Egyptian in the same way that English is not the old English that was spoken in the past.
genetic makeup of the region was greatly altered following the Arab conquest and mass settlement following the expansion of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries, with the majority of native North African Berber groups, as well as the Germanic Vandals and Italic population, either being wiped out or assimilated with the new Middle Eastern Arab population.
I don't know about the first part that they said, but absolutely, North Africa was then dominated by Arabs from Egypt all the way to really Spain. which is why Spain looks the way it does to this day.
Today, the majority of North African countries have a population described as Arab Berber, meaning a mix between the native Berber and Arab population, and this is certainly giving them a unique look, with places like Tunisia having a dominant Arab culture, with the population having the highest proportion of Arab blood of any country of the Maghreb.
This Arab influence is not just seen within the population, but it's also seen within the culture of North Africa. A lot of the time, people will show North African culture and they'll mistake it for Berber culture, which is hilarious. But I'm not saying that I always get it right too, because of course, a lot of Arab culture comes from Africa anyway, if we go by ancient world. And of course, a lot of the people who are in North Africa that we're calling Arabs would have not necessarily been considered Arabs by name in the past. A lot of them were Persians, some were from Syria. So calling them Arabs is a very specific term, but maybe not completely accurate. But there were a lot of Arabs who moved into North Africa.
Migration was not one way, of course, with large migration heading to the Arabian Peninsula and the rest of the Middle East, especially in recent years with Egyptian and Maghrebi migrant workers heading to places like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait. Now, what's interesting about modern Egyptians and other North Africans today is that, depending on the person, they may or may not identify with other ethnic Arabs from places like the Levant or the Arabian Peninsula.
Yes, but most of them do. Most of them actually identify 100% with the Arabs, which is why there is a sort of debate between the ancients or not. Because a lot of them, obviously, there's always that question that if the Middle Easterner type people have been in Africa for so long, why is it that they identify so heavily with the Middle East? And that's a question for another day, but in real life, it has to do with race. Somehow, the entire world fell for the trap of race, and now the sort of, let's say, brown people are fighting against each other while, white people are dancing.
Even if they are Arab speaking as well. Although the Arab language is actually quite a complicated subject, as Arab speakers from different parts of the Middle East and North Africa might not be able to understand each other, with Egyptian Arabic sort of being an intermediate dialect between that spoken in Arabia and the Maghreb, especially considering that the majority of Arabic language motion pictures are filmed in Egypt.
Arab history is interesting and complicated, but of course, it also comes with a turn in a later year. So I do understand why some people, obviously, when looking at ancient Egypt, why they would want to be more associated with the ancient Egyptians than the ancient Arabs. And then, of course, the later Arabs when they become politically relevant and religiously relevant. But we can't play a game like that.
Skin color and facial features are anything but uniform in North Africa, of course, with skin color largely getting darker the further south you look in the region, mostly due to the sub-Saharan African blood and environmental adaptations to the hot, sunny climate.
Or due to the lack of deep Arab admixture. Because as you can see in Mauritania, in Mali, in all kinds of places in Africa, even in South Africa, when the people are mixed, they're very light skinned. I mean, come to South Africa, I'll show you a whole community of people who look exactly like the people in North Africa, and they're mixed with like black and white, and then other groups for the most part.
The native people of North Africa are known as Berbers, and as mentioned earlier, there are also an Afro-Asiatic people group distantly related to Arabs, but their phenotype can vary to include people of all skin colors. Some Berbers
Today, it can vary a lot to inhabit a lot of skin colors, but it's pretty obvious by reading the ancient texts that most of the people who lived in that region were considered very dark skinned.
groups like the Tuaregs of southern Algeria and northern Mali and Niger are very dark in appearance, being the most southern group, and other groups like the Kabyles of northern Algeria are very fair, with a significant proportion having light eyes or hair, with many even being able to pass for European.
The Kabul can pass for European because they have a lot of DNA from Europe. And of course, these people, the Kabul, represent a large language group, and some of them have sub-Saharan African looking people. But of course, you'd have to be in Africa to know this. It's a very large group of people. Race, for the most part, is a social construct. It does map on to real genetics, but race, for the most part, is a social construct. And because of this, um, I do not separate the pale ones from the dark ones and go, these are the real Berbers, these are the real fake Berbers, because Berber is really a cultural thing more than a racial thing. And for this, all Berber people to me are Berber, whether they look European or not.
There's been a large effort in recent years, especially in the Maghrebi countries of Morocco and Algeria, to reclaim their native North African Berber identity, and even many of Arab Berber descent are beginning to create a new Maghrebi identity for themselves. One of the more recent events to influence the North African gene pool was the rise of the Ottoman Empire in the 14th century, when ethnic Turks from the Anatolia region migrated in large numbers during the Ottoman occupation in North African countries. And although it's rare to find full-blooded Turks in North Africa, in the Maghreb up to 20% of the population has at least some Turkish ancestry, and
We're going all over the place again, but let me just, since we're going all over the place, I think I have to remake my video about the greatest world war you've never seen before, because of course the Turks played a large role in North Africa, East Africa, West Africa to some degree, Europe, East, West, and South, the Middle East, and Asia. So this big giant area of fighting is very interesting. I think it's not covered enough by most people.
those of half Turkish, half native descent are called Kalugli, who could have both Berber, Arab, and Turkish ancestry. There was never any large repatriation effort for Kaluglis after the fall of the Ottomans, and their descendants largely integrated into the Arab Berber society. I've talked about Sudan in previous videos, and it's a very tricky situation categorizing their people, since the racial situation of Sudan is anything but homogeneous.
Again, now, today, the modern Sudanese populations are not homogeneous, but back in the day, they definitely were homogeneous. And you could see that they would be the same even if you would go all the way up to Egypt.
The original people groups of Sudan were actually of Nilo-Saharan origin, mostly known as the Nubians, similar to the people of modern South Sudan, and it wasn't until the Islamic Arab invasion and conquest from the north that Sudanese people began to have a more Arab identity. Modern
Before he moves on to the modern Sudanese people, we have to also mention that these Nilo-Saharans spoke an Afro-Asiatic language. And so by him admitting that these people, up until the Arabs came in, were pure African is hilarious if you consider the fact that these pure Africans are known to have spoken a Cushitic language, a Cushitic.
Sudanese Arabs can have a huge range in phenotype, with some having a more Middle Eastern appearance, while some still retain the majority of their sub-Saharan African genes, although full-blooded natives still do exist in large numbers located in the west and south of the country, which was one of the main reasons that South Sudan decided to break away from the north and create their own government, surprisingly with little intervention from the north.
Well, also it tells us that a lot of Arabs must have crossed through Egypt in order to get to Sudan, and a lot of that DNA would have stayed in Egypt, which tells us that a lot of people think about how many Arabs must have come to Sudan to change the population so deeply that some of these people are unrecognizably sub-Saharan African.
The country of Mauritania, on the other end of the continent, is in a very similar position to this, with the majority of its population being Afro-Arabs, albeit with more North African admixture.
Actually, to this day, Mauritanians have mainly black people. Of course, they have these other people, but those people do not consider themselves necessarily different than the other Afro-Asiatic speakers in the region.
Perhaps the most recent event to influence North African demography was the European colonization of the region during the scramble for Africa and before. Algeria had been a part of the French Empire since the 1820s and was actually one of the most well-integrated colonies of any European power, with the population largely being bilingual in French and Arabic or French and a Berber language.
Another potential for increased DNA coming in from the European side. Yes, a lot of people from North Africa do speak French, and yeah.
Since incorporation into France, hundreds of thousands of European settlers began to settle into the region of French North Africa, which included Algeria, Tunisia, and parts of Libya and Morocco, and during the latter half of occupation, French authorities actually allowed a handful of native North Africans from their colonies.
Okay, I think I've covered this video long enough. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, and everything else. Don't forget to study hard, I guess.